Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SLSO Stories live event. If you're familiar with our Lunch and Learn series from last season, you are in the right place. We've broadened the scope of these conversations and put them under the new heading of Stories Live. These virtual events let us go deep with musicians and experts on a specific topic. I'm Tim Munro, Creative Partner with the SLSO, and today we're getting an inside look at playing movie music live with an orchestra. I've loved movies since I was very, very, very little, and the most joyful part of any movie-going experience for me is always that moment after the fanfare, after the quiet, after the first credits, when you hear the first note of music. I feel like it transports you to a new world in a way that almost nothing else can. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk about movie music with a wonderful group of guests: assistant conductor Stephanie Childress, violinist Andrea Jarrett, and violist Leonid Plashinov-Johnson. But first, a housekeeping thing. Please ask questions using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Make sure your message is set to both panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments or questions. It's going to be a fun conversation, and your voice would be a welcome part of it. Particularly, I want to know, what are some of your favorite movie scores? But also, what would you love to hear? Absolutely die to hear the SLSO play live with film. Special thanks to the SLSO's 2021-2022 SLSO Stories live sponsor, Washington University Physicians. And I'm delighted to welcome our guests for this morning, Stephanie, Andrea, and Leo. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining. Let's dive in. I want to know about all of your very first experiences with film. Maybe it's not the very first movie that you saw, but maybe a movie that you saw and just captured something special in you. Maybe Stephanie, let's start with you.
Hello. I was shown some pretty weird movies by my parents when I was younger. Weird as in it doesn't seem very sort of child friendly, but I remember actually one of my first experiences, sort of filmic experiences that I can remember, was actually watching Flash Gordon, if anyone remembers that. My parents are a bit older. They're very much of that generation. And I remember sort of coming into the living room when Flash and the Prince, which is played by Timothy Dalton, they're in the swamp scene. And I just remember seeing these two sort of young guys sort of trying to get out of this swamp, and I was like, okay, this is very interesting. But apart from that, as some of my earliest and happiest memories also with the James Bond franchise, which was clearly more on the violent side for a 4 or 5 year old, but I was into it.
That's wonderful. I love it. I love that. Flash Gordon, I do remember from my youth, and just absolutely loving the absolute bonkersness of that movie. Leo, how about you? Do you have early memories? Is there a particular movie that stands out?
Well, there are several. So I actually originally grew up in Russia, and so my first memories with film were kind of, old cartoons from the Soviet era, and and the music to that was always very stunning. Recorded by wonderful symphony orchestras with a lot of folk undertones within the music. And when I moved to England, I remember, watching vividly, the first Star Wars films and then the first Harry Potter films. That were all composed by John Williams, and so I remember hearing that and just being blown away by the scope and the scale of everything, I think.
Right, and that is something so perfectly captured live on stage, the sound of a full symphony orchestra playing those giant epic scores.
Absolutely.
Andrea, what about you?
Yeah, so it's funny that you ask about influential movies, and then you're like, what's a movie? I can't remember any movies. But I was a big Disney fan growing up, Lion King, classic, tragic, amazing. I also particularly remember watching Wizard of Oz for the first time, and like the sensory overload of when Dorothy first like steps into Oz and it's like colorful all of a sudden. I was like, what? That was a really great moment. So yeah.
Right, and that still holds up today. I mean,
Yeah,
I watched
still
that with
good.
my wife just 6 months ago, and it's like still so incredibly powerful visually. You know, such an old film. And I feel the same way about movie music. Somehow these very old scores still can speak to us so much today. I mean, do you have, Andrea, since I'm chatting with you right now, like what are film scores that you remember noticing? Were there like movies where you remember like noticing the film scores, or was film music part of an early musical interest?
I mean, one of the film scores that stuck out to me the most was actually Nightmare Before Christmas, which still holds as like probably one of my favorite movies of all time. Stephanie knows. We actually watched it together for her first time viewing it around Halloween this year. Like not only was I feel like, I can't remember exactly, but like the technology for that movie itself was like very new, and it was such a like spectacle, like visually. And then, I mean, if you think about what that movie would be without the music, it would be kind of boring. So the way that the music just illuminated everything that was happening, I felt like it just was another level. And like being a young violinist and like being able to identify what my part sounded like and thinking, oh, that's such a beautiful line that the violins get. That's like one of the first times I really noticed the score enhancing it, and you know, the soul like symphonic textures of it sort of like jumped out.
Oh, I love that. Stephanie or Leo?
Well, speaking of film scores, and actually I just realized I actually have a James Bond poster above my head here. It's a Thunderball poster. It's not an original, but anyways, but the music of John Barry, you know, the composer who wrote all of the sort of the big James Bond theme, was always really special. And actually, I think the James Bond franchise is a really interesting way to see how how the producers and stuff were able to monopolize kind of the singer for each movie, and that becomes like a bigger deal, like even in the movie itself. Like recently it was Billie Eilish, but if you think of every James Bond film that came out would have a different title tune, a different theme song, and that would be played by like the hottest, hippest artist in town. And I think for me that really exemplifies perfectly the power of music, even within the movie franchises, something that is sort of so quintessential, such as James Bond. And I mean, going back to my love for Flash Gordon, actually Queen became one of my favorite bands of all time, and they obviously wrote some of the music to some of the really famous sort of starship chases and stuff. So I think even though those movies were movies that I viewed as a child, the music has ended up having a very powerful impact on my life and has kind of seeped through subconsciously, whether I wanted to or not. So yeah, I think movie music can be so important. I remember I studied a course at university which explored the relationship between music and film, and you have all of these very influential kind of dynamic duos, like you think of Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock. A bit later in Italian cinema, there was Federico Fellini and Nino Rota. So I think the two are very complementary, and I'm so pleased that as musicians we get to engage with that, especially with the SLSO.
Right. Oh, that relationship. I mean, I want to come back to that relationship between director and composer as this kind of like symbiotic, beautiful kind of collaboration that feels almost like as close to opera as an operatic collaboration. In the chat, we have extra cheers for John Barry. George says that movies and cartoons created his interest in classical music and opera even as a young child in the 1950s. There's a lovely comment from Eric, whose sister plays horn and listens to her part in all of the scores. And I mean, there's a lot there for French horn. He says that she always loved Dances with Wolves. That's a John Barry score. I have a vague recollection, maybe. Leo, what about you? You mentioned that sort of Russian orchestral music making is like so core. Was there something in that awakened a love for orchestral music?
I think so. It's just that it manages to add such a layer of emotion underneath the story, and I think that that's so special with cartoons of that nature. I would also just say that, you know, we were talking about the relationship between the director and the composer, but something I'd also love to add is that I love watching, you know, Stanley Kubrick films. And what's amazing about those is that he uses, you know, pre-existing classical music in such a perfect way and sets them so incredibly to his films. I mean, I'm just thinking of, you know, Space Odyssey, where he plays the Blue Danube Waltz with the spaceship docking with the space station. And that's just so powerful. And of course, the absolutely insane way which he uses Beethoven 9 in A Clockwork Orange. It just brings a whole new dimension to music that we already know and love, and in such an interesting interpretation.
Oh, I love that. And because it's the holiday season, I have to mention one of my favorite holiday movies, which is Die Hard, which also uses Beethoven 9 as like building towards this moment throughout the entire movie. Little snippets, and just so organically put together. I mean, so thoughtful. I love a big recommendation of Die Hard for anybody who doesn't know it. A+ movie. I do want to. There's a wonderful mention in the chat that we need to point out to the viewers what it takes to make a live to screen performance of a movie, and I want to get into that right now. It is a fascinating kind of. I want to look a little bit behind the curtain on this. So maybe we can start, Stephanie, with you in your role as conducting a live orchestral score with the movie. What do you get? Like, is it different than for a regular subscription week in the materials that you receive?
Yes, it's very different. I would nearly say that it's perhaps more complicated than a subscription week experience for me as a conductor. So I get the score, obviously, as with any other subscription week. However, on top of, you know, having to know the score, if some of the viewers of this chat today have ever been to a movie plus orchestra concert experience, you'll see the conductor not only has his or her score, they have a screen in front of them, which is different from the big screen that hangs above the orchestra. And on that, I'm getting a lot of very important cues, such as the tempo that the music has to go to. Even though the tempo markings are marked on my score, unfortunately, I don't have a metronome in my brain. And sometimes the beat changes from bar to bar. So I have a little clicker that will sort of flash in front of the screen. I also have a little click track in my ear. And I have the film that is playing in front of everyone. However, I have different sorts of time cues. So for example, before the section that we're about to play starts, there's a line that runs across the screen like it's doing here with my hand. And you have to kind of gauge the tempo from this line. And when the line hits the other side of the screen, that's when you're supposed to start. So there are a lot of very important cues, especially I'm referring to the movie that we did just last week, The Muppets Christmas Carol, especially when you have singers and music that you're accompanying, singing lines that you're accompanying. That synchronicity becomes so crucial. Even if you're just, you know, a bar out, for example, it can make an absolutely huge difference. Then it's easier when there's a bit of dialogue and you can the music can flow at its own pace. But there are other movies, like the movie that we're going to do just in the new year, Pixar's Up, where, if you can imagine, if you have seen the movie, there are lots of different moments where the music has to mimic, or in some cases spur on the action. You know, there'll be like a cymbal clash before or during when someone trips or something, or as the big house goes up with the balloons. You know, I'm sure there'll be music to accompany that, which has to fall exactly at the right time, and that makes that makes my job very difficult, but ultimately it is equally rewarding as a subscription concert when everything just aligns perfectly. And I know for the players, it's a very different experience because I have to convince them to go with me no matter what happens, because I'm the one who knows sort of just about what's happening. So yeah, it's very, very different.
That's so interesting. There are a few things I want to pick up, but one thing that occurs to me is, as a conductor, you're often with vocalists having to always follow a voice. So when there's a voice on a track, but you're not listening maybe, or do you find yourself following the voice and not the click? How do you negotiate that kind of dynamic?
Well, I don't know what it's like for different movies with vocalists, because I've only done them. Actually, The Muppets was my first movie just last week. But I will say that the Muppets sing in a bit of an unruly fashion. They're not the most classically trained singers, which means that I have to rely on the click track more than ever, because even if I'm with them one bar, you know, the next bar they might sort of improvise around that. At least what in the movie, you know, they sort of improvise around the beat. And if I were to follow them, we would then be we just wouldn't be together for the third and the fourth bar and things like that. So sometimes you just have to really rely on the click track, and that really does save my life as a conductor.
There's one question in the chat about the different colors on the screen. Are there different meanings for different colors of the objects on the screen that you're looking at? Ted is clearly a close watcher of what happens in the video monitor that you have in front of you.
Well, I'm scared that if I give away all the secrets, you'll know if I'm not doing it right. But there are a couple of colors. I think, for example, a red line at the end is where we stop, and when I stop the orchestra, there are also yellow lines which indicate this. There's a white line which gives me, I think, a bar and a half before we're supposed to start, and then a yellow line which gives me a bar before we start, and then at every downbeat I will receive, there'll be a little sort of white circle that flashes in the middle. So if you can see all of those things during the movie, then I think you should probably be watching the movie rather than my screen. It can be very interesting, I'm sure.
Okay. We'll come back to you, Stephanie. There's some interesting things I want to pick up on again, but I do want to very much ask about Leo and Andrea's experience in the orchestra, because as Stephanie hints, it's a very different experience for you guys. So is it true, do you not have a click in your ear? Like, you don't hear the beat, so you're relying on Stephanie. Is that true, Andrea?
Yeah, I actually, when I first joined the orchestra, this is like 6-7 years ago, we did all have click tracks for, like, I think the very first thing, it was like a big Zelda video game thing, if anyone here went to that, and the entire orchestra was on a click track, and I feel like I was watching everyone just rip them out of their ears.
Interesting.
They're like, I don't want to do this, it's so difficult. Like, it seems like it's very kind of counterintuitive to perform essentially with a metronome, so like we had it, but so I think that, you know, there were some adjustments made, and now the musicians don't use the click track. But I feel, I mean, it's interesting how, like, the trajectory of learning how to do these movies is just like, you do your first one and then all of them sort of make sense, because they are very organized. Like, you do get the occasional one where if there is singing involved, they don't line up with the click because they're taking a lot of liberties, and that did happen with Muppets. And then also Nightmare Before Christmas was another big one, and Gemma was experiencing some, just getting used to that. But other than that, a lot of them just line up pretty perfectly. So yeah.
Well, you said you mentioned that the learning curve is steep. What was it like for your first time doing it? I mean, you mentioned the Zelda experience, but like, what is the hardest thing about this experience, or the most challenging thing?
Sometimes it's when you have, like, I find in movies you will have a lot more repeated figures for extended amounts of time that might not happen in a symphonic work. So you might have like a full page of the same eighth notes and truly just not getting lost in a C, like a whole page of that, or counting your rests carefully and just, you know, staying organized yourself is one of the challenges, I think.
Huh, that's so interesting. Leo, do you find that does that then speak to stamina and focus? Is that a different thing then from playing a subscription week?
Sure. Actually, I was going to say that one of the biggest challenges is the way that the tempo can so change in such a quick way. And it's like, it's amazing how if you write a movie score, I have no idea because I've never written anything in my life, but how you can kind of score time according to what's happening on the screen and how quickly you have to change from one tempo to another. And I think that's kind of one of the harder things to going from tempo to tempo and kind of really being aware of what's happening at all times to not sort of, you know, get lost. I think it's one of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about the way that film scores are recorded, which is in tiny, tiny chunks. But then when you have to play it all in one go, do you find, I know, for instance, I've heard that brass players find it totally exhausting, that percussionists have to end up running from one end to the other end because they're not written to be performed from start to finish. But do you find, Leo, that you're like exhausted by the end, or how do you play with that kind of sense of stamina?
I think it depends on the movie in a large way. I think The Muppets was actually not as tiring as it could have been. One of my first movies that I played, I don't think it was the first, but one of them, I was lucky enough to play The Empire Strikes Back, and that was quite exhausting just because John Williams writes in such a, you know, it's quite difficult music. There's so many notes, and it's really kind of, it blurs the line between movie music and really symphonic music. It's just such dense and incredible music. And so after 2 hours of, you know, Battle of Hoth and Millennium Falcon being chased by the Star Destroyers and the, you know, Bespin and all of this, like it really takes it out of you. You know, there's nothing is the same, and you just keep going for forever, which is amazing.
Stephanie, is it exhausting for you? Like, how's your focus doing it for? And as Leo hints, there are going to be differences for different movies, but you know, when you're on a podium, you're only ever on a podium for at most, I guess, you know, there's the Bruckner Symphony or things like that, but not for 2.5 hours. Or
no, I mean, I'm very pleased that the orchestra found it a relatively relaxing experience, because I will say it was, especially as it was my first, the concentration level for me has to be sort of dialed up by, you know, 50, 100%, because there is so much happening, and you have to just make sure that you're getting the orchestra ready at the right time. I also have a little countdown, sort of little clock on the screen, which tells me how much time I have left before the start of the next passage, the next musical passage. So, I mean, the first show, just getting used to it, you know, as Andrea said and as Leo said, that's the biggest challenge. But then it is sort of, you know, you get into the groove, as with any performance, you know, you get into the swing of things, and then you can sort of relax a tiny bit more. But I think it's definitely slightly more stressful than a normal subscription concert.
Fascinating. And also just like, you don't get to do it many times. It's not like a Beethoven symphony where through your life you might play it 16 times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the point that you made about the percussionists sort of running around as well, yeah, it's, you know, we have to remember that these were not necessarily scored to be performed live. And that's why, you know, especially, I think the thing that I find most challenging, which is a good challenge because it exercises my brain a lot, is like, you know, you'll have different bars, even within the same piece, moving within, will just change tempo just immediately, and you have to be so receptive to the click track and going, okay, this bar is going to be a tiny bit faster and a tiny bit slower. And actually, as a conductor, it really pushes your limits as well, because you have to have so much more kind of control over the orchestra than normal. I mean, these guys have been amazing, because every time, you know, there's a different time signature or we're just moving a bit faster, they have to trust me and I have to make them trust them to go with me, or to go back, or to move forward and sideways and stuff. So it really, I think everyone's senses are ever so slightly heightened in that way.
Well, it sounds like all three of you really enjoy that challenge, and that's a really lovely thing to hear, honestly. It's not a thing that existed 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. This is an entirely new musical thing that you're part of, kind of making it up as it goes along. Just in the chat, there's a beautiful and rather sad story about a wonderful, Eric, who loves the Harry Potter films, brought his youngest daughter, who wasn't quite ready for Harry Potter and was very overwhelmed and frightened, and had to go to the ladies' room. Suzanne is requesting Wuthering Heights with a score by Michel Legrand. There's some lovely old films in here that I just feel like would be great to hit the big screen. Another upvote for Dances with Wolves. And Patricia says Chariots of Fire and Lawrence of Arabia. And what do we have? Ted says, has a big thanks. I've been entranced watching the conductors for these type of concerts over the year. Really appreciate how difficult it is and how seamlessly the conductors and orchestra make it look. I mean, I think hearing from you all today is wonderful, Stephanie, Leo, and Andrea, in that sense of like finding this new challenge and confronting it. Bradley has an unrelated question that I will ask anyway, which is, what happens during intermission? Do you guys fight over the restrooms? I know there's men's rooms and ladies' rooms, changing rooms, but
I don't know. I don't think I'm sort of, for the Muppets, I would just get my score back to my room and study it for the next second half. wasn't a lot of downtime.
How familiar with the movies are Stephanie and the musicians before beginning their work? They watched it once, a couple of times, never. And does it matter at all? Andrea, are there movies you step onto the stage and you've never seen, or do you try to watch the films?
I think I've seen all of the films I can remember that we've played. I like to do one score study session where I'm just watching the movie, and then maybe another actual score study where I might have my music there. I don't think that you need to have seen the movie to be able to play the music, because, the conductor is always prepared and like leading you through that. It helps to have it in your ear. I think mostly I try to make sure I watch it, because otherwise I'm in rehearsal trying to see the screen like this when I don't have to play, and that can be a little distracting. So yeah, I think it's benefit to know what's going on, just so you're not, tempted to look up there while.
Well, I was going to ask if you ever can watch. Are there ever moments that you're so sad not to be able to watch?
Yeah, I mean, with my seat, I'm fourth chair in the second violin, so I'm usually in a pretty good position where I can just sort of do this, and it doesn't look totally distracting. Like some people will really just, do that in rehearsal. So I can usually see it pretty well. Yeah.
Leo, do you ever look back?
Well, I was lucky for the Muppets, because I was, outside of second stand, and so the screen is positioned so that you can look over and watch. But the violas tend to sort of go backwards, and we are rotated all the time. So it's like sometimes you'll get unlucky and sometimes you get lucky, which is, I was lucky. And it was kind of funny. We were talking about watching the movies beforehand. I'm ashamed to admit that I'd never actually seen The Muppet Christmas Carol, but on the week before,
I've never seen it. I've never seen it either.
Have you not? It's really good.
Never seen it.
It was. I had to watch it before we go into the first rehearsal, and having watched it, it was all the more fun to play. It was really fun to watch, and great movie. So,
I have heard, not from the SLSO, but I've heard rumors that people, particularly in the back parts of the orchestra, might actually stream on their phone with the sound down the movie for their rests. But Stephanie, you have the best seat in the house. But I'm assuming you don't
I'm
get to
doing,
enjoy it very much.
Yeah, whatever I'm doing, I'm not watching the movie. I'm just watching for that little sort of obsessive line and the dots and stuff. Yeah, it was funny. There was someone who was on sound desk, and he came up and asked me after one of the rehearsals, like, because he also monitors the sounds that I receive, and there was one bit where there was just a lot of dialogue, and he came up to me and he said, oh, in that bit where there's a lot of dialogue and where the penguins are skating on the ice, like, do you want me to turn the sound down so that you can hear the orchestra? And I was just like, I have no idea which bit you're talking, the penguins on ice or whatever. So really, whenever I'm conducting it, my concentration is all to do with getting everyone in on time. And I do enjoy the films, you know, in my own time beforehand, and I'll try and watch it once without my score and then watch it several times with the score, just to get really prepared. But no, unfortunately, the enjoyment levels when it comes to conducting movies usually comes as sort of the reward after you've done it, rather than throughout the process.
Right, I see lots of nods to that too. Ted asks how many rehearsals are there? Maybe from Leo and Andrea, who have played more of these, how many rehearsals do you typically have before a movie?
I think 2 usually is the magic number. I'm trying to remember if one of the Harry Potters might have had 3, but...
I mean, that's crazy. Yeah. That's like 2 times through the movie.
Yeah, essentially. With, you know, some like, oh, let's tie up some loose ends, and then you just kind of like... Sometimes it feels a little bit like you're like being pushed off a cliff, but it's fine. It's part of the job.
But again, like, you guys seem to revel in the challenge of having a completely different approach, and I think people maybe understand that this is a different experience, which brings me to my next question, which is about, you know, there's so many iconic photographs of from a movie screen out at the movie-going audience. You know, that kind of the look of people watching a movie. Do you ever look at the audience? And I imagine, Stephanie, this is not going to necessarily be relevant for you. But Leo and Andrea, do you have is there a different sense in the house of a movie-going audience?
It's always a lot of fun because, you know, sometimes we have, for the Harry Potter, we had, you know, people dressing up, and, you know, we had some events in the front of the foyer, and it's always a very fun and festive atmosphere, which feels different to normal subscription weeks. Unfortunately, though, from where we're sitting on stage, with the light levels, and, you know, we've got stand lights, and it's kind of difficult to look out into the audience because they're in the dark and we've got lights in front of us, so it's tricky to see.
I think we end up where we can't see them very well, we do hear more audience reactions, like vocally, than you would traditionally hear during like a subscription symphony concert. So I mean, it's very humanizing to hear like laughing and like and like, you know, kind of understanding that there are probably folks in there that are seeing the movie for the very first time, and like that to me is a really, I mean, that sounds so cool. Like being able to see a movie for the first time, and it's with the live orchestra. Yeah, that's great. I'm always waiting for like a time where I might be rotated off a movie so I can go watch it and see what it's like, because I haven't done it yet, but I heard it's great. So
right, and there's a new sound system in the hall. Apparently it sounds spectacular in there for movies. It does make me wonder, Stephanie, that there's a sense that the audiences for classical music hundreds of years ago were much more engaged physically and verbally and whatever. There's much more noise in the house. Is there a way in which like the sounds that you get out of an audience for a film score were like the sounds that a Beethoven symphony would have received, or a Mozart piano concerto, or a Haydn symphony?
Yes, certainly. I mean, with the Muppets, the largest demographic was probably, you know, like under the age of 10. I don't know if in Beethoven's time they had such sophisticated children in the audiences, but definitely the response that you get is absolutely immediate. and it's something that obviously we don't experience really in subscription concerts, sort of live, as it were. I think that's a really nice thing as a musician, is that you can feel as though what you're doing is having an impact in the moment. It's something that we don't experience a lot. You kind of hope that with, you know, especially if there's a new type of audience, or people who have never been to a classical music concert, you kind of hope to sort of plant the seed, you know, at a subscription concert, and let that sort of grow with time. Whereas you can feel with film concerts that they're just fascinated from the get-go, and they want to give you that reaction. I wasn't around during Beethoven's time, so I don't know, but I definitely know that they were sort of as interested as, you know, the children were for the Muppets, for example. I mean, they were also doing a whole bunch of other stuff. People would be playing cards and like drinking a lot, and people would have little meetings in the boxes and like the opera houses and stuff, and get up to all sorts of things, which I don't think the children were doing during the Muppets. But yeah, it is a very visceral reaction that we get out of people, and I really appreciate that.
I love that. That's wonderful. So Lynn in the chat would love to see 2001: A Space Odyssey. I mean, right? I wonder if there's rights issues with some of the music. I don't know. There's George requests early Star Trek movies with music by Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner. There's Mary recounts a beautiful moment of seeing and hearing The Student Prince 3 times in a row at about 6 years old. And she has a very long list of special film music. There's a couple of questions about, specifically about Lord of the Rings movies. And there's some requests for continuing the series. But Leo and Andrea, have you played the Lord of the Rings movies, and what are those? Are those kind of set apart? Because I know that particularly those were thought of almost like big symphonies or big operatic scores. Maybe Leo?
Sure. I love that recommendation. I love the Lord of the Rings movies, and I'd love to play them. They're pretty long movies, so I don't know how that would be. Especially the extended version. I'm assuming we would probably not do that, or maybe we could do that over like 2 days. That would be really cool. I'd imagine that rehearsal time would probably be significant, and the strength on stage and the choirs and all of that. It would be epic, and I would love to be a part of it, actually. So, yeah.
Andrea, I know they've done Lord of the Rings symphonies. Has the SLSO done any of those?
I believe that if they, I think that we've done at least one. It was before I got here. I had not played.
Before you were.
Yeah.
Great.
But yes, the scope of that is like an opera, like plus. So yeah.
It does make me, the mention of opera makes me want to ask about what is the difference between film music and more conventional classical music. Stephanie, is there one kind of answer to that question, or are there like 7 answers to that question?
I mean, quite simply, there are 7 answers. I think what I find fascinating about film music is that you can have music that is a part of the action. I'm trying to think of there's a particular scene in a movie where some guy's in a taxi with the radio. Well, we don't know it's the radio blaring, and it's just sort of film music. And then as soon as he steps out of the taxi and closes the door and the taxi drives off, you can hear the music sort of fading away. On the other side of things, there are, for example, you know, if you look at Alfred Hitchcock's movies with Bernard Herrmann, you know, the music will not be a part of the story. I think we call it the diegesis. It won't be in it, so to speak. It might be responding to it, but it's not something that, as far as we know, the characters can hear. And I think that gives composers and directors a massive scope to explore, you know, what it means to really set something to music in a way that perhaps opera doesn't have, because we know that, you know, there's not this fine line between whether characters are hearing music or not hearing music, because it is just an integral part of the drama. And I think that's, for me, what makes it even more interesting, even just to sort of analyze and to really have a look at. And the way that music influences sometimes also the story can be really interesting. And it's so much more than just sort of, you have sort of someone slips on a banana peel and you have a cymbal crash. It really is. It can be very sophisticated sometimes and requires a lot of I guess, training and, knowledge from both director and composer.
Well, it sounds like your role is more like conducting an opera or a ballet than it is conducting an orchestral concert. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that is fair to say. Yeah, I'm reacting from something that already exists, a piece of art that has already been created, so to speak. It's not a collaborative work where, I'd be looking at the singers and, waiting for a dancer before giving the upbeat, but it's definitely, there is an outside source that is sort of, that influences the music. Yes, for sure.
In the chat, Scott asks, are we going to show a short snippet of a movie in this session? And we will not be, because of rights issues. If you three had to recommend a short snippet of a movie to watch on YouTube after this, or some other format, what would it be? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Maybe I'll give one first. Yeah, I don't... okay, Andrea has one.
All right, because 'tis the season. This just came to mind because I just watched it 2 days ago. Imagine you're watching Home Alone and they're running through the airport and all of that stuff is happening, like that thing, and there's no music. And how would that be different? And it was just silence. And it was like flashing back between that and then Kevin at the house. And then that, like that whole, I think that's a pretty great moment to like realize, what kind of an impact the music is having on the drama.
That's such a beautiful, also as a Chicagoan, seeing O'Hare Airport, even what a chaotic mess it is wonderful. That mention makes me realize there's actually a video on YouTube of the throne room scene from the first Star Wars movie with no music. And it is hilarious. I do highly recommend it to anybody. If you just Google throne room scene, no music. Leo, it sounds like you have seen this also.
I was literally about to mention that. It's so funny that you mentioned it. It's one of the most awkward moments that I've seen in a movie for a long time without the music. But yeah, it's really saved by Mr. Williams, I think. Yeah,
right. I mean, it makes you realize that it's like without George Lucas, it obviously couldn't exist at all. But like without John Williams, it would not. We would not be watching those movies. There's also there's a version of a scene from Jurassic Park with just like a melodica being played as if by like a 4-year-old when the dinosaurs first come into view. That again gives you that sense that it's like, it's not the melody. It's not just the melody that's making this. It is the whole experience. Okay, Stephanie, did you have one?
Yeah, no, that's really funny that you mentioned that, because actually I think for me, one of the most off-putting things is when I find the music doesn't quite complement the movie. And there are some bad movies out there, I will say, where that doesn't happen. And that makes me appreciate good film music all the much more. A movie that I think you could watch without music, but I'll explain why I'm saying this, is Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood with Daniel Day-Lewis. You could watch it without music, but the Johnny Greenwood score, so Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, I will add, who's an absolutely brilliant composer, and he's collaborated a lot with Paul Thomas Anderson. I think they're probably, for me, one of the most, the strongest collaborators, composer, director, I think, of the 21st century. But his score adds just such an element of sort of absurdity, but also it really just doesn't put you at ease, which is very much in tune with, I think, the whole message of the film. If any of you know, it's sort of about an oil man or someone who's looking for oil, and the score just sort of gets under your skin in the same way that the story in the movie does. There's nothing, it doesn't mimic the story in any way, and it's definitely not sort of through composed. The movie doesn't have music to all of the scenes, but it just adds this sense of being ill at ease. And whenever I watch that movie, I kind of tend to be more fascinated by the score than I do by the actual story in front of me, which I think that can be what makes a successful movie score, at least for me.
I love that. That's a brilliant recommendation, particularly because I remember seeing that movie for the first time and imagining myself seeing it with no music and thinking what beautiful images they would be. Such beautiful images. And yet with the score, it unearths something that is entirely removed from what you're seeing and just like adds an extra dimension to it that I think is so powerful. I love that. And I just actually saw the new Jane Campion movie, Power of the Dog, which I recommend to anyone, again, because of that marriage of image and music, another score by Johnny Greenwood. Cora is recommending that also. Again, like something where the performances and the imagery alone don't give you any sense of actually what the undercurrent is going on, which I love. What are we in a kind of? Are we in a golden age? It feels like the age of orchestral film writing has waned somewhat. But Stephanie, do you feel like there's because in a different way we have people coming from different musical worlds creating film scores. I also am thinking of I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's entirely an improvised drum set. The soundtrack is entirely
Birdman, Antonio Sanchez.
Yeah.
Right, an entire sound score that is an improvised drum set soundtrack, and yet I mean, you can't imagine what it would be a different film.
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays, people are so much more receptive to different types of music, and I mean, if we think of film just as a form of media, I mean, it's a part of the cultural current, and I think now that people are beginning to be more open about the types of music that they listen to, more receptive to different cultures. I think it is a really exciting time. And I think, we do have all the sort of Hollywood blockbuster scores and stuff, but especially in independent cinema, you have a lot of great new artists that are actually being more and more recognized due to them being featured in films. I remember I saw a beautiful French film the other day, and a lot of the film was set to Brazilian songs, and that just got me so interested, and I went down sort of the Spotify and YouTube rabbit hole, sort of exploring these different types of genres. But I think it's a really powerful way of getting people to be more open-minded, because you're presenting it in a way where it's not just the music. Especially if it's a particularly emotive story, you will immediately be invested in the film as a person, and then it's much more easy for filmmakers and composers to present different types of music that people might not know of or might not have ever tried exploring. So I think film can be a good vehicle for that, let's say, for different types of music in that way.
I love that. Music, films is like a little catalyst for a rabbit hole. That's wonderful. What about Leo and Andrea? Golden Age? Do you miss that there aren't as many Max Steiners and Korngolds and such? Andrea?
I don't know. I mean, I still watch all of these like older movies, so it doesngoing to feel like they're like gone because they're preserved, and everything is cyclical. So like, just because it might not be here in the same way now doesn't mean it's not going to be like reinvented and even better. And like, what even is better anyway, down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. Leo?
I'm not sure about Golden Age, but it's definitely, as Stephanie said, it's amazing to see films using more genres of music. I remember watching my first few Tarantino films and just being educated very thoroughly by Tarantino's amazing taste in music, from Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill and all of these things. And I love when really great artists collaborate, with each other. I mean, think of Phil Collins's film scores. I mean, like, amazing. Just It's really great when you get combinations of great directors and amazing taste in music with those musicians. So I feel like we all get some great music that we love and listen to independently of the movies after such experiences.
I love that. And that brings us right back to the beginning with Stephanie talking about Queen and Flash Gordon. There's just so many unexpected discoveries and joys. There was a period of my teens when I had a list of all of the John Williams scores, and I was going to own all of them. I didn't, but it's a catalyst to a new world that's really wonderful. Bradley in the chat says, have you guys seen The Greatest Showman? Wonderful music in that one. Andrea, do you know that score? Or have you seen that movie?
I saw the movie. I thought it was really sweet. And I think that somehow I just think that would be a really nice setting in Powell with the way Powell looks aesthetically too. I think it would be a nice match. So yeah.
That's great. Actually, there was a question earlier in the chat that I'll ask now, which is, do the musicians and conductors have any say over what film scores are going to be performed, or is it kind of decided somewhere in Hollywood? Are you aware of that process, and can recommendations, is that ever a thing?
I think if you happen to be married to someone that might serve on the artistic committee in the artistic department at the symphony, there's a possibility that a suggestion could be thrown, but that's definitely not me.
No, that is unrelated. Yes.
I do think that Ian single-handedly pushed for the Muppets though, and because it's his favorite movie of all time. So.
Well, it sounds like it was a big hit based on some of the comments in the chat, so I don't think there was any sadness about that. Well, I have had such a delight talking with the three of you and getting comments from the chat this past hour. I really want to thank Stephanie, Andrea, and Leo. And I want to thank the Stewart Family Foundation and Washington University physicians for their support. And thank you all for joining us with questions and comments. It was really wonderful to feel like the chat was an active, churning conversation throughout the hour. A quick note about some other SLSO goings on. If you'd like to attend the SLSO's next film live in concert, Stephanie is conducting Pixar's film Up on January 2nd. Oh, I almost get teary thinking about it. And this spring, the orchestra will play Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 1, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Star Wars Return of the Jedi. For more information on these concerts, please visit slso.org and keep out an eye for our next Stories live event, which will be in February. Check your inbox next month for more information. Now, let's do the Zoom thing and wave goodbye. Thanks all.